things are nice. Like that guitar, it makes nice music, and that can make you happy.
The answer, my friend, is...
Hi, you got a bomb in here?
Shooting off, Sergeant, just telling folks about Post Toasties, the toasted cornflakes.
At 87, Jim Nabors, the beloved star of Gomer Pyle USMC, sat quietly by the window of his seaside home in Honolulu, the slanting afternoon light tracing the lines of time across his face. In a trembling voice, he whispered, "There are loves that were never allowed to exist." But I lived in one of them with Rock Hudson. For the first time in over half a century, Nabors spoke the name of the man who had changed Hollywood's symbol of perfect masculinity in the 1960s, Rock Hudson. Behind Hudson's dazzling fame and Nabors' gentle smile was a secret relationship that lasted more than a decade, filled with love, lies, silence, and betrayal. A bond that Nabors described as sacred as marriage, but also a wound that never healed. This was not just a love story, it was a tragedy born of fame and silence. And why did Jim Nabors keep that secret buried for more than 50 years, only to reveal near the end of his life that the marriage he once cherished was never a happy one? Let's find out. The answer begins on a summer night in 1963 in Beverly Hills, when two seemingly distant souls crossed paths and destiny began with a single glance. I still remember that night so clearly. Jim Nabors said, his voice lowering as if he were replaying an old reel of his life. Beverly Hills, summer 1963. Nabors had just finished filming The Andy Griffith Show when he received an invitation to a private party hosted by singer Tab Hunter, one of the rare gatherings where gay men could finally breathe freely, far from the paparazzi's cameras. "No one thought I'd show up," he recalled. "I was clumsy, quiet, just wanting to go home and read my script." But that night, Rock showed up. The room was filled with cigarette smoke and jazz music when Rock Hudson walked in, tall, sophisticated, with a presence that made everyone turn their heads. He lifted his glass, walked straight to Nabors and said, "I've seen you perform, Jim, and I think someone like you deserves to be truly loved." Nabors recalled that the whole room seemed to pause. He wasn't shy, not afraid of anything. And me, just looking at him made the world suddenly easier to breathe in. From that night on, the two began to meet. They sought each other out in rare, stolen moments, late nights at Rock's Palm Springs villa, which Hudson called the only place where we can be real. They sang together, cooked together, and dreamed of a future where they wouldn't have to hide. Rock wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. Nabors said, his eyes distant. He was strong, confident, and made me believe we could take on the whole world. But that world, Hollywood, never stayed quiet for long. Rumors began to spread after a party where Hudson was caught giving Nabors a look that was too affectionate. Universal Pictures warned him, "Don't let anyone photograph you two together." Then one night at the end of 1964, Hudson came to Nabors' small apartment in Los Angeles. Nabors remembered he didn't bring flowers, didn't smile, just sat down quietly and stayed silent for a long time before saying the words that Nabors would never forget. "If anyone asks, just say we're friends?" "Okay." Nabors sighed as he recounted it. That sentence cut like a knife. He said it gently, but I could hear the ending in his voice. Trying to stay calm, he asked, "What about everything between us? Rock, are we just friends now?" Hudson looked out the window, avoiding his gaze. "I don't have a choice. They're threatening to cancel my contract. I just need you to understand." He left right after that. Nabors said, his hands trembling. No hug, no kiss. The door closed, and all I could hear was the ticking of the clock. I knew from that moment on our love would have to live in silence. He paused, then whispered, "I thought I was stronger than that. But when you love someone, just one sentence, 'We're just friends,' is enough to make everything collapse." From then on, Nabors and Hudson only met at social events, smiling politely like strangers. But behind every smile was the pain Nabors carried alone. "We thought we could hide it forever," he said. "But in Hollywood, nothing stays secret forever. Our love began in the light and ended in darkness. And as the light of fame grew brighter, that love began to melt away in the cold." After that night in late 1964, when Rock Hudson uttered the words, "We're just friends," everything inside Jim Nabors crumbled. Yet he still held on to a fragile hope that the man he loved might come back. That hope lasted exactly 2 years, until Rock signed a new contract with Universal Pictures in early 1966. The contract preserved Hudson's A-list status, but it came with a harsh condition. He had to maintain the image of the perfect gentleman, meaning the public could only see a Rock Hudson who was strong, charming, and always accompanied by beautiful women. That was when Nabors realized that the man who once said he loved him had stepped into another role, one that would define the rest of his life. After 1966, Rock began appearing everywhere in the press alongside famous actresses, Doris Day, Phyllis Gates, Carol Burnett. The magazines called them Hollywood's golden couples. As for Nabors, when he looked at those photos, he simply folded the newspaper in silence. He wasn't angry, only empty, as if the man in those pictures was no longer the Rock Hudson he had once known. The distance between them gradually became absolute. The phone calls grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. The short flights to Hawaii that Hudson once called private getaways were no more. Nabors kept waiting still, believing the man was just busy. But the longer he waited, the clearer it became he had been left behind. The only news he had of Rock now came from the papers, glittering premieres, photos with beautiful actresses, and glowing words from fans praising the ideal image of a perfect man. In 1967, Hudson went to Europe to film Tobruk. For 6 months abroad, he didn't send Nabors a single line. When he returned, Rock invited Jim to the Los Angeles premiere. Nabors went holding on to a fragile hope that maybe somehow they would speak, even if only to exchange an old greeting. But Rock merely shook his hand perfunctorily for the cameras, then turned and smiled at a female co-star. Nabors stood alone in the grand lobby, surrounded by the blinding flashes of dozens of cameras, dazzling and cold enough to suffocate. After that night, everything became clear. Rock Hudson had crossed into another world, the world of fame, where Jim Nabors no longer existed. When rumors of their unusually close friendship began appearing in a tabloid, Hudson reacted harshly. He immediately cut off all contact, ordered his lawyer to deny everything, and avoided Nabors completely. Jim tried calling. The line rang, but no one picked up. After a few tries, he understood he had been erased from Rock Hudson's life. In the summer of 1969, Nabors was hospitalized from exhaustion. Doctors said he was suffering from nervous fatigue and advised him to rest and leave Los Angeles for a while. Jim chose Hawaii, the place that had once been their secret escape. But this time, he went alone. He rented a small beachfront house in Honolulu, sang old songs, and tried to forget the voice and smile that had haunted him for years. Even far away, he still followed Hudson through the news. Each time he saw Rock's name on a magazine cover, it felt like an old wound reopening. He didn't hate him. He only felt pity, knowing that behind that perfect exterior was a man living two lives, one for Hollywood and one for himself. By the end of 1970, Nabors returned to the stage, but his voice had changed. It was deeper, heavier, and carried an unmistakable sadness. In a backstage interview, when asked whether he still kept in touch with Rock Hudson, Nabors simply smiled faintly and replied, "He's busy playing his role." The words sounded light, but they carried all the bitterness in the world. Jim Nabors never hated Hudson. He once said their love didn't die because they stopped loving each other, but because Hollywood never allowed it to exist. Hudson chose the light of fame. Nabors chose the truth of his heart. But that choice left them both lonely on opposite sides, one lonely in the spotlight, the other in the shadows. Years later, when he looked back on that time, Nabors only sighed. He said, "Rock Hudson was a man with two faces, one for the world, charming, strong, perfect, and one that only Nabors ever knew, fragile, frightened, and willing to deny love just to protect a role." But in the end, Hudson lost himself in that role. Jim Nabors said the most painful part wasn't being abandoned, it was living with the memory that the man he loved once said, "We're just friends," and truly believed it. But fate wasn't done yet. A seemingly harmless joke would soon shake all of Hollywood and rob Jim Nabors of his final chance to say goodbye. In 1972, Los Angeles was the epicenter of lavish parties where stars lived under flashing lights and endless gossip. But in that world, even one small joke could destroy a person's entire life. Jim Nabors knew that only too late. A group of friends in the television circle who knew Hudson socially made up a story that Rock Hudson and Jim Nabors had secretly held a gay wedding in Hawaii. It started as a drunken joke at a party when someone combined their names into Rock Pyle, mixing Rock Hudson with Nabors' famous character Gomer Pyle. They laughed it off, thinking it was just a bit of harmless teasing. But overnight, the joke spread like wildfire. The next morning, tabloid headlines screamed across Los Angeles: Rock Hudson marries Jim Nabors in secret Waikiki ceremony. The rumor spread through Hollywood like a storm into every studio, every cafe, every whispered conversation on Sunset Boulevard. In an era when even a hint of homosexuality could end a career, this story was a death sentence. Rock Hudson panicked. Within 24 hours, Universal forced him to issue a public denial. Standing before dozens of reporters, Hudson said coldly, "I have never had any kind of relationship with Jim Nabors. We are just friends." For Nabors, those words felt like a punch to the heart. I'd heard that sentence before he said at age 87, but this time he said it to the whole world. While Hudson's PR team rushed to contain the scandal, Jim Nabors was completely alone. He stayed in Hawaii, once their peaceful refuge, now a place to hide from the whispers. Reporters knocked on his door, neighbors gossiped, angry fans sent hate letters, and some even threw effigies of Gomer Pyle into the Waikiki surf to mock him. Television wasn't kind either. Several sponsors withdrew their contracts and his music show was canceled. Many fans who once adored Jim Nabors now looked at him differently, half with pity, half with disdain. He didn't go out for months. By day, Nabors sat by the window staring out at the sea where the waves crashed endlessly against the shore like the rhythm of a painful past that refused to fade. At night, he drank, playing his old recordings, hearing in his mind Rock Hudson's voice softly singing Danny Boy in the living room of the Palm Springs house they once shared. "I kept listening to it," he said, as if he were still there, just too afraid to come closer. Friends urged him to speak out, to even file a lawsuit to defend his name. But Nabors only shook his head. "If I speak, they'll say I'm confirming the rumor. If I stay silent, they'll say I'm scared. Whatever I do, I've already lost." In the end, he chose silence. Not because he was weak, but because he was tired. While Hudson publicly denied everything, Nabors was painted as a man using the scandal for attention. He understood that in Hollywood's eyes, Hudson would always be the perfect man, and he would forever be the small-time singer clinging to a bigger star. Years later, neighbors could still recall that afternoon, the moment Hudson's denial aired on television. He sat alone, lights off, staring at the screen. Hudson, dressed in a suit, wore a faint smile and calmly told reporters there was no such thing as a wedding in Hawaii. Neighbors said, "I looked into his eyes through that screen and realized that in his eyes I no longer existed." The Rock Pyle story became a running joke for years. At Hollywood parties, people mentioned it as a bit of lighthearted gossip. Neighbors, whenever he heard his name used as a punchline, simply forced a faint smile. He chose to protect his image, he said, and I chose silence. That was the last time we ever saw each other. After 1975, the two cut all contact. No calls, no letters, not even a backward glance. Hollywood kept shining as if no scandal had ever happened, while Neighbors lived quietly in his small Honolulu home, planting flowers, raising dogs, and singing only for himself. But the loneliness remained deep, quiet, and unending. He once confessed that what hurt the most wasn't the humiliation, but being denied by the man he loved. Rock Hudson could deny him before the world, but Neighbors could never deny his own heart. He had loved, and that love, though buried in silence, lived on as a scar that never healed. Each time the sea breeze swept in, it brought back the nights in Palm Springs when they held hands and promised to overcome everything. "We believed love was strong enough," Neighbors said. But in the end, fear won. As he told the story, his eyes glistened. "I don't resent Rock. I just regret. Because if he'd had the courage to hold my hand one more time, maybe both our lives would have been different." Hollywood saw it as a funny story, a harmless joke. But for Jim Neighbors, it was a tragedy. The tragedy of a man who loved someone too afraid to love him back. 10 years later, when death came knocking on Rock Hudson's door, it was he himself who reopened the past to say a belated apology. June 1984. Los Angeles sweltered under the summer heat. In a private hospital near Beverly Hills, Rock Hudson sat alone by the window, watching the stream of cars glittering under the afternoon sun. Doctors had just told him the results were positive AIDS, a disease the world then saw as a death sentence. The news not only shocked Hollywood, but shattered Rock Hudson, the man once hailed as America's ultimate symbol of masculinity. For weeks afterward, he avoided all calls and refused to appear in public. Those close to him said Hudson spent sleepless nights writing something in a small notebook, then tearing the pages apart and throwing them away. No one knew whom he was writing to until singer Doris Day, his longtime friend, was called to visit. According to Doris, Hudson sat in silence for a long while before opening a drawer and pulling out a neatly folded white envelope. "Please, give this to Jim," he said hoarsely. On the outside, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "To Jim, the one I never stopped missing." In the letter, Hudson wrote, "I spent my whole life playing someone else. If there's a next life, I want to love you openly, not in the dark, not in fear." Doris Day kept her promise. A few weeks later, the envelope arrived in Honolulu, Hawaii, where Jim Neighbors had been living in quiet seclusion since the 1972 scandal. When the mailman left, Neighbors held the envelope for a long time without opening it. "I knew who it was from. I knew exactly what words waited inside. But I was afraid that if I read it, everything would come rushing back." It took him nearly a full day to finally open it. He didn't cry. He simply sat there reading the letter over and over, then placed it atop the piano, the same one where he'd once sung Danny Boy for Hudson 20 years earlier. "I don't know if it was an apology or a farewell," Neighbors said softly, "but to me, it was both." He never made the letter public. When asked about Hudson years later, Nabors simply said, "I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I wanted peace." It wasn't an easy forgiveness, but the result of decades of inner torment. In his heart, Rock Hudson was still the man who had once made him believe in love, and also the man who taught him what absolute loneliness felt like. In October 1985, Rock Hudson passed away at his Beverly Hills home. The news dominated every front page, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. Nabors heard it that morning on the radio while making coffee. He set the cup down, sat quietly for a moment, and said softly to his longtime partner Stan Cadwallader, "He's gone home." Hudson was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the resting place of Hollywood's biggest stars. Nabors didn't attend the funeral, didn't send condolences, and didn't speak to the press. But a few days later, a pure white wreath arrived at the cemetery with a small note attached to my only friend who truly saw me. There was no signature, but everyone knew who it was from. Journalists sought Nabors out asking about his relationship with Hudson. He replied quietly, "He was once everything but Hollywood turned us into strangers." Then he shut his door and refused all interviews. After the funeral, Nabors officially left Los Angeles, the city of lights and lies where he had lost his love, his fame, and his youth. He returned to Honolulu, bought a small farm, and lived with Stan Cadwallader, the man who would stay by his side for the rest of his life. No more cameras, no more stages. Nabors spent his days planting, caring for his dogs, and singing old ballads to himself. Yet somewhere in the sound of the wind and the ocean waves, he could still hear Rock Hudson's voice, deep, warm, and distant. At 87, when he looked back on those years, Nabors would gaze toward the sea as if a familiar figure still lingered beyond the horizon. "I never forgot him," he said, "but I learned how to forgive." Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about learning to live. That love had been buried for nearly half a century beneath the dust of fame and silence, but the wound it left never healed. And for Jim Nabors, forgiveness didn't erase the pain, it only helped him accept that some things cannot be repaired no matter how much time passes. And many years later, at 87, he finally decided to tell everything, as a way to lay down the weight he had carried all his life. March 2017, Honolulu. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the still blue sea. In a small room overlooking Ala Moana Bay, Jim Nabors sat across from a young reporter from People magazine. At 87, he still had that gentle look, the slow smile, but his voice had grown raspy with age. When the reporter mentioned Rock Hudson's name, he paused for a few seconds, his eyes flickering with an emotion that was half warmth, half sorrow. "You know," Nabors said softly, his voice trembling, "it's been years since anyone said his name aloud. But in my head, Rock's voice has never gone silent." The conversation that day hadn't been planned. The reporter had only wanted to talk about his music and career, but Nabors, perhaps knowing his time was short, opened the door to memories he'd spent a lifetime hiding. He began to speak about Rock Hudson, about a love that had once been Hollywood's best-kept secret, and the wound that never stopped aching in his heart. He smiled faintly. "People ask me all the time, did we really get married? The answer is no, at least not in the way the world defines marriage. But for me, that love, those years we lived together, sharing everything, holding on to each other through fear and loneliness, it felt no different from a marriage, only it wasn't a good one." The reporter sat silently, not daring to interrupt. Jim Nabors spoke slowly, each sentence cutting like an old scar reopened. He said that in the years after Hudson's death, he often dreamed of him. In those dreams, Rock sat beside the old wooden piano where they used to sing Danny Boy, the song Nabors once called the melody of destiny. Every time I sing that song, he said quietly, I still feel him here right next to me, as if he never left. There are nights when I wake to the sound of the waves and think I can hear his voice calling from the porch. After Hudson's death, Nabors spent the rest of his life in Hawaii, far from Hollywood. He ran a small farm in Honolulu, planted flowers, raised dogs, and sang for himself. Every morning he woke early, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window facing the sea. On the table stood an old photo of the two of them in Palm Springs, 1964, a picture he had kept since the day they met. Many thought Nabors had forgotten. He didn't mention Hudson anymore, didn't cry, didn't speak his name. But close friends said that whenever someone happened to bring it up, he would stop, look into the distance for a few seconds, and quietly say, I hope he's found peace. In 2013, Jim Nabors legally married Stan Cadwallader, his partner of more than 30 years. The ceremony was simple, held quietly at their seaside home with only a few close friends in attendance. He smiled gently and said, At last I can call someone my husband without fear. But when a friend asked, Have you forgotten Rock? Nabors fell silent. After a pause, he softly replied, No one can ever replace something that once hurt that much. Jim Nabors understood that his life was defined by the clash of two worlds, the dazzling light of fame and the cold shadow of forbidden love. In his later years, he began to speak more openly about the past, not to place blame, but to find release. Both Rock and I were victims of our time, he said. We had to pretend in order to survive. He chose to hide through silence, and I chose silence to keep him in my heart. When the reporter asked if you could go back, would you change anything? Nabors smiled faintly. No, I would still love him. No matter how much it hurt, I wouldn't want a life without that love because it taught me what truth really means. At the end of the interview, Nabors looked out toward the sea, his gaze as if speaking to someone unseen. Maybe somewhere Rock is listening, he said softly, and I hope he knows I forgave him long ago. When the reporter left, Nabors remained by the piano, gently pressing the keys. The first notes of Danny Boy drifted into the room, faint, trembling, and filled with feeling. His voice quivered as he sang slow and low as though calling to an old spirit. At the end of 2017, Jim Nabors passed away peacefully in his sleep at his Honolulu home. He left without pain in quiet serenity. On the table beside his bed, there was an old photo of the two of them taken in Palm Springs in 1964, and next to it, a small handwritten note, "Forgiven." Just one word, but it carried a lifetime. It was the closing line of a half-century love story, a farewell to what he once called a marriage that wasn't good, but was more real than any role Hollywood ever created. On the day of his funeral, the sea at Honolulu was calm and still. Upon his grave, someone placed a pure white wreath identical to the one he had once sent to Rock Hudson's. No one knew who brought it. Some said it was Stan, others claimed it was an old friend. But those who knew the story believed it was fate coming full circle to close a forbidden love. Jim Nabors once said, "I'm not afraid of death. I'm only afraid of dying without ever having lived truthfully." And perhaps only when he closed his eyes for the last time did he finally live truthfully. No more fear, no more hiding, no more having to call love by another name. Amid the sound of Honolulu's waves, people say that on clear moonlit nights, you can still hear a faint voice singing from his old house the familiar melody of Danny Boy drifting through the air like a soft goodbye, a thank you, and a final message to the man he loved all his life. The story of Jim Nabors and Rock Hudson, whether it was a real love affair or simply a late-life confession, remains one of the clearest reflections of an era when love had to bow before fame, when people lived in fear of being rejected by the very world they served. They loved each other in the dark, stayed silent beneath the spotlight, and left behind wounds that would never heal. It wasn't just the tragedy of two stars, it was a symbol of an entire generation of Hollywood icons who lived under the lights, but died in loneliness. Jim Nabors carried that love with him all his life as a reminder that some truths, no matter how painful, are still worth being spoken. If you believe that a painful truth is still worth more than a lifelong lie, then please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to join us in uncovering the untold secrets of those who seemed perfect, yet hid behind the spotlight, hearts full of stories no one dared to tell.